Let me tell you a story. Okay, customer migrates dozens of servers into Azure. The migration is considered a success, right? Applications are running, users are happy, project team celebrates. Then 6 months later, the problem starts to begin. Nobody knows who owns which resource. Costs are increasing every month. Permissions have become a mess. Nobody can agree on a naming standard. Security teams cannot easily apply controls consistently. Different teams are building things in completely different ways, and suddenly the customer realizes they haven't built a cloud platform. They've built another data center. Just one that happens to be running in Azure. The problem wasn't the migration. The problem was the foundation. That's exactly why Azure landing zones exist. In the last episode, we conducted our discovery workshop, right, with our kind of make-believe client, IT Geek Network Limited. We identified their business goals, right, their challenges, their constraints, and the outcomes they wanted to achieve from Azure. Today, we're taking that next step. We're actually going to design the Azure foundation that everyone else will sit on. No servers, no applications, no databases, the foundation. Because if discovery is the blueprint, right, the landing zone is that sort of concrete slab that gets poured before the building can go up. And just like a real building, if the foundation is weak, eventually everything else that sits on top of it starts to crack. Before we start designing anything, I want to clear up a bit of a misconception. When many people hear the term landing zone, they immediately think about networking, or maybe subscriptions, or management groups, or policy, right? But while those things are certainly part of it, a landing zone is actually much bigger than that. Microsoft describes Azure landing zones as an implementation of cloud adoption framework that helps organizations prepare Azure environments to host workloads securely and consistently. The landing zone provides foundational capabilities including governance, identity, security, networking and management rather than simply a collection of deployed resources. Think of it this way, a workload is a house, a landing zone is the entire neighborhood. Before you build your house, you need roads, right? You need street signs, you need zoning laws, right? You need utilities and security. You need to make sure it's got governance. You need to ensure you've got standards. The landing zone provides those things. Without them, everyone starts building differently and eventually the environment becomes difficult to manage. For our client, the IAM IT Limited Manufacturing Company, our goal is not simply to create an Azure environment. Our goal is to create an environment that will be manageable 3 years from now. That distinction matters. Before I design anything for a customer, I revisit those discovery findings. This is something many architects and consultants skip. They run discovery, write some notes, put them aside and start designing based on personal preference or previous experience. That's really dangerous. Good architecture should be driven by business outcomes. So let's quickly remind ourselves what we learned about our client. They have approximately 500 users, right? They are running primarily on-premises infrastructure. Their data center lease is going to expire in 18 months. And they want a better resilience. They want improved security, right? And they are planning international growth. We know that their IT team is relatively small and don't have those skills in Azure. And they need a platform that can scale without creating unnecessary operational complexities. Notice something really interesting here. Nothing there says build the most sophisticated Azure environment possible. There's nothing that says deploy every Azure feature available, right? Nothing says make the architecture look really impressive. The design needs to support the business. That's it. One of the biggest mistakes I see is architects over-engineering environments because they're designing for what the customer might need in 10 years, rather than what the customer actually needs today. A landing zone should support growth, but it shouldn't create complexity for complexity's sake. Whenever I'm designing a landing zone, I ask myself a simple question. What will this customer look like in 3 years? Not because I can predict the future perfectly, but because a good architecture leaves room for growth. Let's imagine our client expands into 3 more countries, right? Let's imagine they acquire another organization. Maybe they open a second Azure subscription. Let's imagine they build new applications. Would our platform support that growth? Or would we have to redesign everything? The reason I ask these questions is because landing zones are incredibly difficult to retrofit later. It's much easier to create structure earlier than it is to reorganize chaos after hundreds of thousands of resources exist. This doesn't mean overbuilding. It means being intentional. We're creating an environment that's ready for change. Because change is one thing every Azure environment is guaranteed to experience. One of the first things I tend to think about is organization. Not the Azure services, not the workloads, the actual structure, right? Imagine you walk into a library and every book is piled randomly on the floor. All the books might technically be there, but good luck finding anything. Same thing happens in Azure, right? If there is no structure, nobody knows where things live or who owns them. As the Azure environment grows, confusion grows alongside it. This is why we establish organizational structure early. We want a clear separation between different areas of the business, right? We want clear ownership as well. We want clarity around who is responsible for what. For our client, we might start thinking about separating production workloads from non-production workloads, right? We might think about separating platform services from application services. We might even think about future business growth, right? What if they acquire another company? Or what if another business unit needs its own environment? Again, we're not making these decisions because Azure requires it. We're making these decisions because businesses evolve. Good structure gives us flexibility. Something I often tell customers is this: in the cloud, identity is a new perimeter. In traditional data centers, security often focused heavily on network boundaries, right? In modern cloud environments, identity becomes one of those most important control points. Who can access what? Who can make changes? Who approves those changes? And how do we reduce risk? Microsoft's Cloud Adoption Framework highlights identity as a foundational capability that should be established early in cloud adoption, because governance, security, and operational controls depend on it. For our client, we already know they have a relatively small IT team, right? That means we don't want dozens of administrators sharing privileged accounts. We don't want permissions handed out ad hoc, right? And we don't want people receiving broad access because it's convenient. Instead, we want a model that remains manageable as the organization grows. The landing zone design should support that. You don't need to understand every technical detail today. You just need to understand this principle. A good Azure foundation starts by controlling who can do what. One of the most underrated concepts in Azure is governance, because governance isn't exciting. Nobody brags about governance at conferences. Nobody gets excited about policies. But governance is one of the biggest differences between a successful Azure environment and a chaotic one. Governance is essentially agreeing on the rules before people start building. Think about driving, right? Road rules feel restrictive until you remove them. Then things get dangerous very quickly. Azure is the same. Good governance helps customers stay secure, stay compliant, remain consistent, and control costs. The reality is that most governance conversations happen too late. A customer starts building, resources appear everywhere, right? Standards become inconsistent. Then everyone tries to clean up the mess afterwards. That's much harder. At the landing zone stage, we have an opportunity to establish expectations before the environment grows. Eventually, every landing zone conversation reaches networking, and networking is important. But I often see organizations obsess over networking too early while ignoring governance, identity, and operational requirements. Networking should support the business goals. For our client, we know they have users in Australia and the UK. We know future growth is possible as well, right? We know security is going to matter, and we know reliability matters. Those business requirements will influence networking decisions later. I often explain networking like city planning, right? Roads matter, but roads alone don't create a city. A city requires rules, services, ownership, security, and management. Likewise, networking is only one piece of the landing zone puzzle. The key thing at this stage is ensuring the future architecture remains scalable. We don't need every answer today, but we need a framework that supports future decisions. One of the most important questions I ask when reviewing any landing zone design is, who will operate this? Because eventually consultants leave, projects end, the customer takes ownership, and when that happens, the operational model becomes incredibly important. For our client in this example, we know their team is relatively small. That fact should influence our design. The goal isn't to create something that only an Azure expert can manage. The goal is to create something that their team can confidently operate. This is where practical consulting actually differs from textbook architecture. The technically perfect solution is worthless if nobody can support it. Simplicity is often underrated. Clarity is underrated. Documentation is underrated, and operational processes are underrated. The best landing zones don't just support workloads, they support people. Listen, if you're enjoying this Azure Consultant Playbook series, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. One thing I'd love to know from you is this. What do you think is the most commonly overlooked part of Azure design? Do you think it's governance? Do you you think it's identity? Maybe security or cost management, or is it something else entirely? Drop a comment below because I'd love to hear your experiences, especially if you've worked in Azure environments that grew without sort of proper planning. Now let's move into the Consultant Copilot corner and see how AI is going to help us design our landing zone. This is where things start to get really interesting, right? Imagine you take everything we learned about our client during the discovery workshop. Those business drivers, the risks, those stakeholder requirements, the growth plans, those constraints around operationality we spoke about, and then you ask AI a simple question. Design an Azure landing zone for this organization. Within seconds, AI will likely generate recommendations. It might suggest organizational structures, right? Subscription strategies, governance controls, right? Maybe security recommendations, networking approaches, and honestly, a lot of advice will sound reasonable. This is where many people are going to stop. They see the AI output and they assume the design is complete. But this is exactly why consultants still matter. The value isn't the first draft. The value is the review. Right? As consultants, our job is to evaluate the recommendations and ask questions. Does this recommendation fit the customer? Is it overly complicated? Is it missing something? Or does it align with business priorities? Can the customer actually operate it? AI is very good at generating possibilities. Consultants are responsible for making decisions. Let me give you an example, right? AI might suggest a large enterprise-style architecture with multiple layers of governance and complexity. Technically, that might be correct, but for our client size and maturity, it's going to be excessive. So the consultant would simplify, refine, adapt, right? This is how I see AI fitting into the modern architecture. It's an accelerator, a thinking partner, a research assistant, right? A documentation assistant. But it still needs human judgment. The best results happen when expert knowledge and AI work together, right? Not when one replaces the other. At this point, we're beginning to form a vision of our client's landing zone, right? It needs to provide structure. It needs to support growth. It needs to enable governance, right? It needs to establish a strong identity foundation. It needs to support security as well as remain manageable. And finally, it needs to provide a platform for future workloads. Notice that I haven't actually talked much about individual Azure resources and services. That's intentional because landing zones aren't about services, they're about foundations. Services will come later, workloads will come later, applications, they all come later, but the foundation comes first. And if we get that right, every future decision becomes much easier. So in this episode, we've built the blueprint for the foundation, right? We've looked at how consultants think about landing zones, governance, organizational structure, identity, operational readiness, growth and scalability. But one area keeps appearing again and again: identity. Who gets access? Who has administrative privileges, right? How security decisions are made? How we control risk, and that's where we're heading next. In episode 3, we're going to focus entirely on identity architecture using Microsoft Entra. We'll look at how consultants approach identity design, common mistakes organizations make, and why identity is often the most important security decision you'll make in Azure. And of course, we're going to use AI to help evaluate and improve our identity strategy inside the Consultant Copilot corner. Listen, if you enjoy this episode, make sure you subscribe and enable notifications so you don't miss episode 3 of the Azure Consultant Playbook AI Edition. If you found this video valuable, share it with your colleague who's working on Azure adoption, because a good landing zone can save years of frustration later. And I want to see you in the comments, right? Answer this question. If you were designing a brand new Azure environment tomorrow, what's the very first thing you would focus on? Thanks for watching, and remember, great environments aren't built workload by workload. They're built foundation first.